it got to be the point where he would say, I worked for him about 2.5 years, you know, Ed Keegan, he's a jerk, and he just like throw you something on him, and then you go find out about him. By the same token, he would do things that were, you'd think you have everything covered in a story, and we communicated to him by memorandum, was what you have here. And as it turned out, I'm the only leg man that kept the memos to Royko, which I find very strange. He'd read the whole thing and through and say, Litvaskus, isn't that a Lithuanian name? And you look at him like, oh, that's a Lithuanian name. And so you'd go back, and then like, when did they come over? And that would be the story. That would be the angle on the story. Okay. Some other times it would come up, and one of his most famous stories was just Over the Transom, and I just served it up to him whole. That was the Faceless Vet series that got sort of a Nixon, who'd been bunkered by Watergate, out of holding an impromptu press conference, and we managed to hold the source for like 3 days, and then released him to talk to the rest of the media of the United States. So it was a great postgraduate degree, and Royko is really, really a Renaissance man in lots of ways, and very much more refined personality than he would portray himself as.
Well, why don't we stop? The tape is about over, and take a small break.
Okay.
We had been talking about your time as a leg man with Mike Royko. Just one or two other questions. I mean, you read that Royko was a difficult guy. He drank a lot. What I'm hearing in terms like Renaissance man is a very different kind of Mike Royko. How do you reconcile those images?
I mean, it's a complex personality. I mean, I would see him, my desk was in the back corner. His is the farthest back corner. He had a cubbyhole. But I was in the back row, and I would see him coming in the city room, and it was clear that he had a terrible hangover on. And so what I would do is I'd pull on my headset. They're like, you know, telephone operator headsets. That's what we use for phones and typewriters. And I would call up weather or any other, one of the few recorded things that were available, and just to have my head down and be typing, because I didn't want any contact with him while he was there. And then, you know, 11:30, somehow, you know, the hangover or the coffee would pass, and then he'd come out into the sauntering through the city room and starting the process of testing angles for his what he's talking about, what it was, and just being very jovial and personable and all that stuff. But he was a big drinker, and it got worse. I mean, after he was always a big drinker. This was in 72 to 74, and he was still writing from every day. And Richard J. Daley was still alive, and all the characters were still out there. But after his wife Carol died, then he really went off the deep end. And I remember, you know, going out with him one night, all night, drinking. And then he wanted to go to the copper bars, and I said, no, that's enough for me. But that he would also get mean when he and more egotistical when he really got drunk. So he'd go to the Goats and, you know, pound Billy Goat's Tavern under Lower Wabash, and the first Billy Goat's, and he'd, you know, pound vodka, and you know, people would come up to him, just, you know, tourists or whatever, and sometimes he could be like really, really mean. But the more he drank, the more egotistical he got, and sort of the meaner he got. So yeah, they're both there. But by the same token, he would, I mean, he was one of the early subscribers to the Musical Heritage Society, and he was, you know, into sort of wines and keeping a cellar long before anybody was doing that sort of thing. And he was you know, he wouldn't fly because he was afraid he would die or something in the airplanes. But but he was a extraordinary person.
Mm-hmm. Now, who are some of the other Mike Ryko leg men?
Well, I was number 4.
Mm-hmm.
So number 3 was Ellen Warren, who's still at the Tribune.
Mm-hmm.
And then her husband, his name I can never, Wade Nelson, if I remember, was after me. And then he went to, for a long time, he was like Al the Pal Dixon, Secretary of State, and then United States Senator's press secretary.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's working for Daley as a speechwriter.
Mm-hmm.
Number 1 was Terry Schaefer, who was the first one, and I don't know what became of Terry. Number 2 was John Foreman, and he would write monographs on Winston Churchill and stuff, and Ryko wrote a spectacular letter of recommendation to him for the LA Times, and I saw it and I went back in his office and said, what did you can't stand this guy. What did you see? He said, well, I wanted to write it in such a way that if they let him go, they would feel like they were fools, because I don't want to see him again. And so he did that, and then Hanky Gratteau, who was became the managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, was a long-time city editor of the Tribune. She was the most senior. She was a copy girl at the time when I was there. And then she served 3 times. One, when he went to the Sun-Times, he took her back so that she would have a job. And then when he went to the Tribune, he did the same thing, sort of save her. So Hanky is senior. And then there were lots more afterwards. And sometimes he would have reunions. I only went to one. I was gone a lot, but
it sounds like law clerks for judges almost.
it is law clerks.
Where there's a kind of collegial spirit.
Right. So there's one. He had one party. We had remarried to Judy, and he was happy, sort of the first time. And then he had a party at their house, and which is my great irony. He always needled me and would send me into the projects because he wanted to toughen me up because I'd grown up in the suburbs. Right? So I had to learn how to live. And then he's the one that ends up in Winnetka, right? So, but he had a party at his house in which he'd come up with another collection of his columns, tremendous moneymakers. And so he gave us each a book, and then he had inscribed each of the books. And so this is a great insight into Ryko. So we opened our books. So he said, go ahead and open it for the president. And so we all opened them up, and very quickly it became we all had the same inscription was, "Dear Paul, you were the best. Don't tell the others." So we're all there together. So obviously we're all telling each other. So, but that was his kind of fun.
Now, if I have my memory right, your next job was with John Calloway,
Right.
whose memorial service, unfortunately, we went to just a week ago.
Right.
And how did you get that job?
I was working for Ryko. He called up, Calloway called up. He was just starting up this idea of having a nightly news show on Channel 11. And it was sort of, I think KQED or somebody else had done it, having public TV had a news program. So he called up and said, would I be interested? And, it was inevitable. I mean, I always thought I was, going to be my father when I grew up, and I've always sort of throughout the rest of my life has always been wanted to be my father and wanted to be Ryko. That those are the 2 things I was trained for. Sort of never did. But he called me up, and then he made me an offer, and he was going to start this thing from scratch. So I went to tell Ryko, and he was like fine with it. And then the managing editor and the editor of the paper called me in and told me I was great and all this kind of stuff, and that they wanted making me an offer. And so I remember coming out and to stay because I had a real future in that business. Of course, that business didn't have much future, but
well, it had a future for a while.
It did have a future for a while, and it will have a future again, but it's, and so I just was inevitable. I had to go to TV. I'd grown up in it. And so I went, and it was probably a terrible mistake, but I went anyway. And so I worked with, we started up at 5400 North St. Louis, where the WTTW stations are, and started then and started to like design sets and figure out what we're going to do. And there were 4 of us, 4 reporter producers, none of whom I was the closest experience to television that they had, and that was my sitting in a studio as a little boy. And so we were reporter producers and had to fill 28 minutes and 30 seconds 5 nights a week. And it was tough.
Now, how was this supposed to differ from the 10 o'clock news on Channel 5 or Channel 7, Channel 2?
Well, the difference was that it would be in-depth. So it was like, long before, McNeil Lehrer, the NewsHour, the idea was that you would have stories in depth. You'd be able to really look into issues over time, whereas the stations were not quite as short as they are now, but still had shorter news. There were more summaries of the news.
Right. So this is even before Nightline.
Oh yeah.
Oh
yeah, for sure. And so there were things that you could do, like I did when I covered Richard J. Daley's 1975 run for mayor, in which he ran like a person possessed. I mean, there was no way he was going to lose, but he was just driving himself. I got to do this huge long piece that was, terrible video quality because these cameras have never been out in the street or in the world. And but by the same token, I could do like 12 minutes. And part of it was photographer John Randolph was a still photographer, had gone out and shot him. And so the end of it was like, 3 minutes of Every Man a King, Huey Long's song, with this photo montage of Richard J. Daley. And so you could really get into depth. I remember having a long interview with Lyndon LaRouche, who was the perpetual nutcase for president, and talking to him about his platform, which is bubonic plague was going to come up from South America and those kind of things.
Now, you say it was a disaster, and it was a mistake probably, but what made it? So far, I haven't heard that it is a disaster, except the cameras were bad.
No, it was because it's a huge amount of time, and that it's I'm not sure. I mean, I think some of the stories were really good. It was Calloway was a great schmoozer and a great interviewer, and he went off schmoozing and building audience, and we were left by ourselves with like a producer who was, and we just didn't do adequate amount of disciplined work in the time we had to produce a decent product.